Welcome to Life Stories, where real-life transformations and profound lessons unfold. Today, we bring you the story of a young man named Ryan, who, after being forced by his wealthy father to live a life of hardship on a remote farm, discovers what truly matters, from a life of luxury and privilege to the harsh realities of farm life. Ryan's journey is one of self-discovery, resilience, and the search for purpose. Stay tuned as we dive into this incredible transformation. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel to start today's story. The office was unnervingly still. The weight of silence in that room pressed down on me like a heavy, suffocating blanket. Every detail seemed designed to remind me of the distance between my father and me. His polished mahogany desk, the walls lined with prestigious awards, and the soft ticking of the grandfather clock that seemed to echo louder with each passing second. I sat across from him, my jaw clenched in defiance, staring at my father as if he were some kind of stranger. His cold, calculating gaze never wavered, and I could feel the anger boiling beneath my skin. "Enough of your games, Ryan," my father, Jonathan Thompson, finally said. His voice was firm, as hard as steel, as though he had long decided that the time for tolerance had ended. "Your reckless behavior, the parties, the women, the money wasted on God knows what, it ends now." I shifted uncomfortably in my chair. I'd heard this speech before, countless times. The disappointment, the lectures, the self-righteousness in his words. It was always the same. A predictable cycle. But today, there was something different. There was a finality to his tone that sent a chill through me. "You think I'm just going to sit back and watch you ruin everything I've built?" he continued, leaning forward, his ice blue eyes locked on mine. His voice getting sharper, colder. "No more trust fund. No more endless credit cards. No more freedom." I scoffed, trying to hide the unease creeping up my throat. "What? You're going to ground me? Dad, I'm not a teenager anymore." He didn't even flinch. Instead, a cold smile curled on his lips. But it wasn't kind. It was cruel. Almost as if the punishment he was about to deal out gave him some sort of satisfaction. "No, Ryan, I'm not going to ground you. I'm going to fix you." The confusion clouding my thoughts only deepened. "Fix me?" I repeated, my voice laced with disbelief. "What the hell are you talking about?" "You're going to get married," he said simply, as if the words held no weight. As if they were something I could just accept without question. The shock hit me like a punch to the gut. "Married?" I could hardly believe what I was hearing. This has to be some kind of twisted joke. My father didn't flinch, his expression impassive, as if my disbelief didn't matter. "You don't have a choice." My heart pounded in my chest. This was not just some overbearing demand, it felt like a war strategy. My father had always been controlling. Yes. But this was something else entirely. "Who is she? Some high society debutante you picked out from one of your fancy parties?" I spat, trying to hold on to some semblance of dignity, of rebellion. "No," he answered, his gaze never leaving mine. "Her name is Lily. She's a farmer." "A farmer?" I felt the words crackle in the air like a joke that wasn't funny. Something beyond my ability to comprehend. "A farmer?" I repeated, my voice rising in disbelief. "You want me to marry a farmer in Vermont? I don't even know this woman." "Yes," he said, his tone unyielding. "She's hardworking, she's honorable, and she lives a life that you desperately need to understand." My mind raced, trying to process this madness. I'd spent my entire life surrounded by wealth and privilege, immersed in a world where power, influence, and luxury meant everything. But now, my father was demanding I leave all of that behind and marry a stranger, a farmer. No less, in a place like Vermont. Far from the glittering world I was accustomed to. "You can't be serious," I muttered, my voice shaky with a mixture of confusion and anger. "You want me to marry someone I've never met and live in the middle of nowhere?" His gaze remained steady, his words final. "Yes. Consider it a fresh start." I wanted to scream. I wanted to shout, to tell him how absurd this was. But the cold certainty in his eyes silenced me. This wasn't a joke. This wasn't a challenge. It was a command. I slumped back in my chair, feeling the weight of my father's ultimatum settle around me like a vice. I had no choice. 2 days, my father said, his voice smooth, almost satisfied with the decision he'd made. You leave in 2 days. I suggest you get your affairs in order. I didn't respond. I couldn't. All I could do was sit there, drowning in the reality of the life my father had just forced upon me. As he turned to walk out of the room, I allowed myself to take a breath. My life as I knew it was over. The next 2 days passed in a blur of disbelief. I could barely wrap my head around it. My father, always so rigid, so controlling, had pushed me to this. He had taken away everything I thought I could rely on: money, luxury, freedom, and replaced it with this. A marriage to a farmer. A woman I didn't know. And a life I had no desire to live. It felt like my entire world had turned upside down. But there was nothing I could do. 2 days later, I found myself standing at the edge of a dusty gravel road, staring down a narrow, winding path that led to the farmhouse I'd been forced to call home for the foreseeable future. Vermont. The name alone seemed to mock me. It was nothing like the city lights of New York or the glitz of the high society circles I was used to. Instead, it smelled of earth and grass. The air too fresh for my liking. A stark reminder of how far I had fallen from the life I had known. I had never imagined myself in a place like this. So far removed from the comforts of luxury. My polished city shoes sank slightly into the dirt. An uncomfortable reminder of my unfamiliarity with the land. With each step I took toward the farmhouse, it felt as though I was walking further away from everything I had once held dear. The farmhouse itself was modest, with chipped white paint and a wraparound porch that looked like it hadn't seen a fresh coat of paint in years. It was small and worn down, a far cry from the penthouse views I was used to. But even so, there was something about it, something undeniably real, that I couldn't quite ignore. It wasn't home, but it wasn't a place to be dismissed either. I lifted my suitcase, feeling its weight pressing against my shoulder as I walked up the path. The front door creaked open before I could knock. And there she was, Lily. I had no idea what to expect. But when I saw her, I was caught off guard. She wasn't what I had imagined at all. She stood there in faded jeans, worn boots, and a simple plaid shirt. Her hair tied back in a loose ponytail. Her face was serious, unsmiling, but there was a strength in her presence that was impossible to ignore. It was as though the very land itself had shaped her resilience. Her eyes met mine, assessing me with a calmness I wasn't used to. I had always been the center of attention in New York, always surrounded by people eager to cater to my every whim. But Lily? She didn't seem the least bit interested in my wealth or status. Her gaze was steady, almost skeptical, as if she couldn't quite believe that someone like me would be standing on her doorstep. You must be Ryan Thompson, she said, her voice cool and measured, as though my father's promise had been too absurd to believe. Yeah, that's me, I said, trying to sound casual, but the uncertainty was creeping in. I set my suitcase down on the porch with a loud thud, half expecting her to say something about it. She didn't. Instead, she crossed her arms over her chest, her eyes scanning me from head to toe, making me feel exposed, like she could see every ounce of privilege I carried with me. It was uncomfortable. I guess your father didn't tell you much about me, she said, her tone still even, but there was an underlying sharpness to it. I didn't ask for this. I didn't want it. Her words caught me off guard. I had assumed she was in on this whole thing. Some desperate woman from the country who had jumped at the chance to marry into money. But her tone told me otherwise. She had no interest in me. Not in the way I had imagined. No warmth. No desire for the life I could offer. She was here because she had to be. Well, that makes two of us, I muttered, my bitterness seeping through despite my attempts to remain composed. I didn't exactly sign up for this either. Lily nodded slightly, but there was no softening in her expression. She wasn't here to comfort me or make me feel better about this situation. Well, she said, glancing at my suitcase, you're here now. We might as well get on with it. Without another word, she turned and walked back into the house, leaving the door open behind her. I hesitated for a moment, staring after her, before picking up my suitcase and following her inside. The interior of the house was small, yet clean, with well-worn furniture and a few personal touches that made it feel lived in. It wasn't the cold, sterile luxury of my New York penthouse. But there was something undeniably warm about it. Something real. It wasn't a place I would choose. But I knew I had no say in the matter. This was my new life now. Lily didn't waste time with pleasantries. She pointed me toward a room at the end of the hall. A sparse bedroom with a small bed, a dresser, and a window that looked out over the endless fields. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. For now, I told myself. This was temporary, a bump in the road. I was sure I'd find a way out soon enough. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that my life, the life I had known, was slipping away from me. The first morning on the farm came too soon. I wasn't used to this early rising, to the roosters crowing before dawn, or the cold morning air that cut through the thin walls of my room. Back in New York, I'd wake up when I felt like it, often recovering from the late nights and long parties. Here, there was no room for laziness. No room for the endless indulgence I had once known. I heard a knock on my door long before the sun was fully up. "Get up, Ryan," Lily's voice called out, sharp and commanding. "We've got work to do." I groaned, trying to pull the blankets over my head and escape the reality of the situation. But I knew better than to resist. This wasn't a life of luxury anymore. It was raw, physical labor. The sooner I accepted that, the easier it would be. Reluctantly, I dragged myself out of bed, pulling on the same clothes I had worn yesterday, still too clean, too polished for a place like this. But there was nothing I could do. I was stuck in this world now, whether I liked it or not. When I made my way outside, I found Lily already hard at work. Her sleeves were rolled up, and she was carrying feed to the animals without even acknowledging my presence. I stood there for a moment, unsure of what to do. When she turned to me, her eyes narrowing, "Grab that shovel," she said briskly. "You'll be mucking out the stalls today." Mucking out the... My voice faltered. I had never done anything like that in my life. I had no idea what she meant. But the disgust in my stomach was immediate. There were horses, cows, pigs. All of them needed to be cleaned up after. And that responsibility had now fallen to me. "Do I look like I know anything about farming?" I asked, feeling foolish and exposed. Lily didn't hesitate. "Then you'll learn." Her voice was cold, but there was something else beneath it, something I couldn't quite place. Determination. Maybe. She wasn't offering sympathy, but she wasn't going to let me off the hook either. For the next few hours, I worked in silence, trying to get used to the pungent smells and the heavy lifting. Every movement felt awkward, and my body screamed in protest. This wasn't the life I was used to, the polished parties, the elegant dinners, the effortless luxury. It was grimy and exhausting, and the work seemed never ending. But as the day wore on, I began to notice something. It wasn't the work itself that changed me, but the quiet, the calm of the farm. There was a stillness to the mornings that I had never appreciated before. The silence was different from the noise of the city, the honking horns, the constant rush of life. Here, there was space to breathe. The sounds of the wind rustling through the trees and the distant calls of the animals brought a strange sense of peace I hadn't expected. Lily continued to move through the day with an almost robotic precision. There was no time for doubt, no time for weakness. She carried on with the farm work as if it were second nature. And I couldn't help but admire her for it. I'd never met anyone who worked like her, who gave everything, day in and day out, without complaint. By midday, I was sweaty, sore, and utterly exhausted. My back ached with every movement, and my hands were blistered from gripping the shovel. But when Lily returned to check on me, there was a glimmer of something in her eyes, a hint of approval. Maybe, though she said little. "How's it going?" she asked, her voice neutral. "Terrible," I replied, too tired to care about sounding anything but frustrated. "I don't know how you do this every day." Lily didn't respond right away. Instead, she took a long look at my work, inspecting it with a critical eye. "It's not bad," she said finally, her tone almost surprising in its lack of scorn. "But you're not done." I sighed in exasperation, my muscles aching, but I didn't dare protest. There was no room for complaints here. There was no one to do it for me. I was in this alone. And if I didn't pull my weight, I'd only make things harder on myself. Keep going, Lily said, turning back to her own tasks. We don't stop until it's done. The rest of the day passed in a blur of frustration and exhaustion. By the time the sun began to set, I was sore in places I didn't know I had. But for the first time, I realized something about Lily. She wasn't asking for anything from me. She wasn't expecting me to be perfect. She just needed me to try. And despite my best efforts to resist, I found that I was starting to do just that. Try. Days turned into weeks, and something in me began to shift. The work was still grueling. The hours long and exhausting. But I couldn't deny that there was a rhythm to it. A strange, almost meditative quality to the labor that seemed to ground me in a way I hadn't known before. I was no longer completely revolted by the daily chores. My body had started to adapt to the physical demands of farm life. And though I was far from skilled, I was no longer completely useless either. I was learning, but even more than the work itself, there was something else, something that was changing within me. I found myself drawn to the stillness of the farm. The mornings were quiet in a way that New York never could be. Filled with the sounds of nature instead of the constant noise of the city. The evenings, when I would sit on the porch with Lily, were peaceful, the soft rustling of the wind in the trees filling the silence between us. We still didn't talk much. Our interactions remained mostly businesslike, focused on the tasks at hand, but there was a subtle shift between us. I could see her beginning to trust me more. And for the first time, I realized that maybe I was starting to earn her respect. She wasn't just the woman I had been forced to marry anymore. She was someone I admired. Someone whose strength and determination were becoming more apparent with each passing day. And then, just when I thought I was beginning to find my place here, my father called. The phone call came on a quiet evening after a long day of work. I was standing in the kitchen, wiping the dirt from my hands when I heard the sharp ring of the phone. I picked it up, already knowing who it was. Ryan. My father's voice came through the line, crisp and businesslike as always. How's life on the farm? I hesitated before answering, unsure of how to respond. I couldn't deny that I had gotten used to the farm, to the simplicity of it, but admitting that to him felt like admitting defeat. It's fine, I said cautiously. What's this about, Dad? There was a pause on the other end, the kind of pause I had learned to dread. My father didn't make casual conversation. He had an agenda, and I knew it. I have an offer for you, he said smoothly. You've been out there long enough. I think it's time for you to come home. I felt a twist of unease in my stomach. For the first time in weeks, I was afraid of what this call meant. Afraid of what my father would ask of me. What kind of offer? You've proven you can handle responsibility, he continued, his voice as cool and calculating as ever. I'm willing to bring you back into the fold. Take up a position at the company. But there are conditions. I held my breath. I knew what was coming next. You'll return to New York. Take the job. And leave the farm. Leave Lily. This was always meant to be temporary. Ryan, I didn't expect you to stay out there forever. Now it's time to come home. His words felt like a blow. The final punch to the life I had tried to build here. I could feel the weight of his expectations pressing down on me, reminding me of everything I had left behind in New York. The power, the wealth, the position, it was all there, waiting for me to return. But in that moment, something inside me snapped. I glanced out the window, my gaze falling on Lily, who was out in the field tending to the animals as she always did. A sense of peace settled over me. This was the life I had started to build. This was the life that mattered. I swallowed hard, forcing the words out. I need to think about it. Don't take too long, my father warned. You don't have forever. I hung up the phone, feeling a tightness in my chest that had nothing to do with the weight of my father's offer. I was stuck between two worlds now. Two lives that felt so completely different from one another. One was the life I had always known, the life of privilege, of luxury, of endless opportunities. The other was the life I had grown into on the farm, a life that wasn't glamorous or easy, but one that was real, honest, full of hard work, but full of meaning. As I stood in the kitchen, staring out the window at Lily, I realized that I wasn't ready to leave this behind. I wasn't ready to give up what I had found here. Not yet. Not ever. As the days passed, the weight of my father's ultimatum continued to hang over me. But something had shifted deep within me. The decision was no longer as clear-cut as it had once seemed. I had spent so much of my life chasing after things, status, money, power, but now, I wasn't sure if those things mattered anymore. My time on the farm, living alongside Lily, had opened my eyes to something I had never fully understood: the value of simplicity, of hard work, and of finding meaning in the everyday. One morning, as I stood in the kitchen, the phone rang again. I knew who it was before I even picked up the receiver. My father's voice was as cold and calculating as ever. But this time, I didn't feel the same urgency to please him. "Ryan," he said, his tone clipped. "Have you made your decision?" I looked out the window, where Lily was tending to the animals. Her movements as steady and purposeful as ever. The farm had become my home. And in Lily, I had found someone I could respect. I wasn't about to walk away from that. "I've made my decision," I said, my voice firm and unwavering. "I'm staying here. I'm not coming back to New York. I'm not leaving the farm." There was a long silence on the other end of the line before my father's voice finally returned, filled with anger and disbelief. "You're making a mistake." Maybe I was, I thought, but it was my mistake to make. As I hung up the phone, I felt a sense of peace wash over me. I had chosen this life. This simple, honest life. And for the first time, I knew I was exactly where I was meant to be. Thank you for joining me on this journey. Don't forget to subscribe to Life Stories for more inspiring tales.